The following program contains rare footage of both an historic and scientific nature. Some has been preserved in archives, while other footage has been transmitted from deep space probes, such as NASA's Voyager 1 and 2 satellites. Because of the unique and spectacular nature of this footage, the producers have chosen to leave this footage unaltered in order to give the viewer an accurate and first-hand look at these remarkable scenes.
Look into the delicate living ceiling that covers our planet and take an amazing journey into space and time. Day or night, you see fascinating evidence of places and times so far removed from planet Earth that they're virtually impossible for us Earthlings to comprehend. We know that light travels at 186,000 miles per second, nearly 10 million times faster than the fastest car. Yet, when we look at our own sun, we are in fact seeing light that took 8 minutes to reach us. When we look at the light of Proxima Centauri, the star nearest our sun, we see light that began its journey to Earth more than 4 years ago. Perhaps the farthest object that can be seen with the naked human eye is the brightest light in the constellation Andromeda. When we look at the Andromeda galaxy, we are seeing light that spent nearly 2 million years on its journey to Earth. Man has never been satisfied with his ability to see into space. He has constantly sought to build bigger, more powerful telescopes, to put more and more satellites into space, and even to travel there himself. Modern man has always been proud of his ability to reach farther and farther beyond his planet. And with today's deep space probes and space-borne telescopes, he can now solve some of the oldest mysteries of the cosmos. Yet the only reason modern man can see so far into the depths of space is because he's standing firmly on the shoulders of the thousands of brave and curious men and women who came before him. For centuries, pioneers of astronomy and space travel have been risking their lives and reputations to sift the facts about our cosmos from the superstitions. These pioneers have ranged from ancient artists and philosophers to scientists and mathematicians. They have been early Greeks poring over hand-drawn charts to modern American astronauts stuffed into bulky spacesuits, walking on the face of the moon.
Who was the first man to try for a space flight? Ah, that's right. Who? Wan Hu. According to ancient accounts, this Ming Dynasty astronaut fitted his bamboo spacecraft with all the black powder fire rockets it would hold. And when the rockets were ignited by a platoon of pigtailed technicians, Wan Hu was converted gloriously from the living to legend.
The earliest space visionaries sacrificed much to understand the mysteries outside the portals of planet Earth. Early man looked into the sky with awe and reverence and tried to make sense of the unknowable. History is strewn with evidence of man's feeble attempts to understand the worlds around him. There are ancient pyramids, altars and temples to the stars. There are dramatic and mysterious objects like the huge upright stones at Stonehenge near Salisbury, England. This 4,000 to 5,000-year-old monument consists of 4 concentric circles of huge rock pillars. The outermost ring is about 100 feet in diameter. The entire structure is surrounded by a 5-foot-wide ditch. The site has been frequently desecrated and violated over the centuries. The ancient Romans tore down a number of the huge buttress stones, and more recently, stonemasons quarried many of the huge rocks. But despite the violence, the monument remains a place where the imagination can soar. No one truly knows the exact purpose of the mysterious structure. No one knows why early builders decided to move these enormous stones long before wheels, cranes, or hydraulics to the Salisbury Plain. But it is apparent the structure is part of man's efforts to understand the dome of the sky. Near the main group of Stonehenge pillars stands a solitary rock. This so-called heel stone marks a sight line that once a year leads directly to the rising sun. This particular sunrise comes on the longest day of the year, the so-called solstice. It's not difficult to see these upright stones as an attempt to harness the heavens. They could have served as an early calendar, helping man predict the seasons, helping him put his difficult life into some kind of order. These Stonehenge builders and other of our ancestors, all now long dead, worked hard and risked much to provide us with truths about the working of the universe. Yet modern man's inflated ego frequently causes him to forget the golden scientific legacy that he's building on. In our modern age, with all the high technology and scientific achievements, it's easy to sneer at the way our forefathers were so often fooled about the heavens. It's true that the years haven't been kind to many of the most widely held theories and speculations of past centuries. Beliefs once accepted as truth now seem ridiculous when held up to the light of modern science. When viewed through the telescope of time, it's hard to believe our ancestors could have been so frequently wrong about some very obvious truths. Early astronomers once believed the Earth was flat, that the planets and the sun orbited the Earth, and that the cosmos was infinite, without a beginning or an end. But keep in mind that early man's attempts to harness the universe were made even more complicated by the fact he was working with such crude tools. Early Greeks actually laid the groundwork for modern astronomy, without telescopes or rocket power or computers. They attempted to understand deep space using only the naked human eye.
We have a go for main engine start. We have main engine start. 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
We have liftoff of America's first space shuttle. And the shuttle has cleared the tower. Down farewell program. Go. Roger, roll. Roll program complete. Roger, roll complete.
Today's space program actually began when the ancient Greeks looked into a night sky filled with lights and flashes and began to notice that some of the lights were moving. They also noticed that some of the lights twinkled while others were constant. We now know that the steady lights are planets. The twinkling lights are faraway stars whose light is being altered and bent as it travels through Earth's atmosphere. The Greeks also noticed that the twinkling lights appeared to stay in one place, while the constant lights moved in a predictable path across the sky. That realization started an intellectual journey that continues to this day. We now know that the 5 moving lights are the 5 planets closest to Earth: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Because of the relative nearness of the planets, early astronomers could make out the movement. The stars were also moving around the galaxy, but because of the enormous distances involved, the human eye couldn't detect the change. The early Greeks were obsessed with these moving pinpoints of light that they labeled wandering stars. The name planet actually comes from the Greek word for wandering. Using their mathematical talents, the Greeks began trying to determine where the planets were moving. The early scientists charted a circular path governed by some common central point. The Greeks loved order and clean, clear answers to complex questions. So their scientists assumed the planetary paths were perfect circles. And they concluded that the central point of all this movement was Earth. In about the 2nd century A.D., Claudius Ptolemy, a respected Greek astronomer living in Egypt, devised a complex system that would allow the existing planet orbits to actually move around the Earth. Ptolemy believed the solar system lined up like this: first the Earth, then the Moon, the Sun, Venus, Mercury, Mars, Jupiter, and finally Saturn. This Ptolemaic system is ridiculed today, but it was widely accepted as truth for nearly 1,000 years. Only a few brave souls openly disputed Ptolemy's version of the mechanics of the solar system because church leaders of the day believed the Ptolemaic system followed biblical principles. The scientific community ignored a host of clear signs that Ptolemy was wrong. For instance, it was plain to see that light from nearby planets varied in intensity. This should have been a clear sign that the distance between Earth and the planets changed dramatically during their orbits, indicating that the Earth was also moving in an orbit of its own. Ptolemy's errors survived a long, intellectually stagnant period in man's history that is often referred to as the Dark Ages. This era of intellectual and religious persecution lasted until the 15th century. Some of the credit for bringing light to the Dark Ages has to go to a young Polish astronomer who came to his study of the heavens with a curious and open mind. Nikolai Copernicus was an educated and sophisticated young man. A doctor who also studied for a career in the church, Copernicus began to spot the weaknesses in the Ptolemaic system. Scanning and charting the skies, still working without a telescope, Copernicus saw that the solar system, including the Earth, most likely revolved around the sun's center of gravity. After a lifetime of research and challenging the beliefs of the past, Copernicus developed many of the views of the solar system that are still held today. He managed to place the planets in the proper order and quickly saw the true center of the solar system was the sun and not the Earth. It is said that it was on his deathbed that Copernicus saw the first copies of his book on the revolutions of the heavenly orbs, which laid the groundwork for much of the future progress in understanding space. Building on Copernicus' foundation, future astronomers like Johannes Kepler and Isaac Newton began to get a firmer grip on the workings of space. Copernicus had continued to see the planetary orbits as a series of perfect circles. While Kepler was studying Mars, he noticed that things weren't as clean as all that. He saw that the true orbits were elliptical in shape. Newton found the reason for this unusual path. He discovered that the pressure from the core of heavenly bodies gave them an attractive force that we now know as gravity. The sun's enormous gravitational pull constantly tugged at the planets in our solar system. This pressure explained the elliptical orbits. The planets tested the sun's gravitational pressure in the farthest part of their orbit, only to be pulled back to the sun in the closest part of their path. Interestingly, both Kepler and Newton first came to their revolutionary ideas in a flash of fortuitous brilliance. It is said that Kepler's initial understanding of elliptical orbits first came to him in a dream. Newton, on the other hand, claimed that he began to grasp the laws of gravity when an apple fell from a tree and bounced off his head. Man's direct interaction with space shifted into a new gear in 1564, when Galileo Galilei was born in Italy. In 1609, Galileo took the invention of a spectacle maker in Flanders and began turning it toward the heavens. Man had his first true glimpse of space. But just gazing into space was never enough. Man has long been dreaming of taking his show on the road, of actually seeing these mysteries for himself, of actually traveling into space. As early as the 2nd century AD, wishful fiction began to emerge about man soaring beyond Earth. Some early Greek writings told of a voyage to the moon on a ship launched by a waterspout. An English bishop named Francis Goodwin wrote in 1683 of an imaginary trip to the moon in a craft pulled by a flock of geese. One of the first true space visionaries was the 19th century French writer Jules Verne. In his plausible tale From the Earth to the Moon, which was written in 1865, he shot several space travelers out of a giant space gun or cannon. Interestingly, the launch was made from Florida, not far from one of the homes of the American space program, Cape Canaveral. While a human couldn't have survived the trauma of the cannon launching Verne described, the French dreamer was still moving man closer and closer to the truth of space travel. Actually, Verne's rare understanding of what the future held revealed itself in a number of other areas. In 1994, an unpublished Verne manuscript was discovered in a trunk in the garage of his great-grandson. The story, written in 1863, predicted the development of fax machines, railways, automobiles, and the electric chair to replace the guillotine. Verne's writings also influenced one of the pioneers of rocketry, Russian Konstantin Tsiolkovsky. Tsiolkovsky had very little formal education and had been deaf from childhood. He was something of a rocket hobbyist, frequently experimenting with a technology that had been considered only for children's toys and occasionally as weapons of war. After reading Verne, Tsiolkovsky concluded that rockets could actually be used to take payloads, even men, into space. Working completely independent of Tsiolkovsky, American Robert Goddard was coming to similar conclusions. It was a chilly New England morning in March of 1926 when Robert Goddard turned the heat up on the race to space. Goddard was a college professor in Worcester, Massachusetts, who had decided years before that he could design a vehicle capable of flying to the moon. While men like Tsiolkovsky generally just developed theories about space travel, Goddard actually built and flew rockets. On this day, he was launching a new rocket in a field near the home of his Aunt Effie. This rocket was the first to use liquid fuel instead of a dry propellant like gunpowder. Goddard's mixture of liquid oxygen and gasoline proved to be the right concoction. The small rocket stayed aloft for 12.5 seconds, and in that short time, it opened the door a crack on space travel. Goddard's space flight attracted much favorable publicity, although the noise and fire did frighten some residents of the area. But his early efforts didn't get a lot of support. So-called experts and the bureaucrats in the scientific community were loudly critical of Goddard's efforts. There was even a famous editorial in the New York Times that accused Goddard of being ignorant of the most elementary rules of physics. Goddard was right, the Times was wrong. Part of the controversy that swirled around the work of both Tsiolkovsky and Goddard and other pioneers of rocket flight was a belief that rocket propulsion wouldn't work in the vacuum of free space. Many scientists of that day believed that burning rocket fuel required the opposite reaction of the Earth's atmosphere to produce the force needed to push a rocket into space. Goddard and Tsiolkovsky saw that this wasn't true. As long as they took along the oxygen needed to produce combustion, a rocket would work perfectly well in space. That realization freed scientists to contemplate space voyages that could maneuver around the heavens. Spacecraft of this period took a fairly sinister turn as the work of several German rocket engineers was added to the body of knowledge on the subject. The Germans had developed a liquid-fueled rocket called the V2 during World War II. While not extremely accurate, the V2 was frightening and did some terrible damage to London during the final stages of the war. Post-war research became a battle as the United States and Soviet Union began battling to move the fastest and the farthest into space. Sputnik 1 broke through the Earth's atmosphere in October of 1957. It was a tiny ball weighing less than 100 kilograms and carried only a weak radio transmitter. Sputnik's name came from the Russian word for fellow traveler, and the tiny satellite caught the world by surprise and storm. There are millions of people who remember the day Sputnik was launched, and many who insist they actually saw the satellite flying through the air. Their memories are either overheated, or they're actually remembering the sight of parts of the rocket that pushed Sputnik into space. The actual satellite was far too small to be seen with the naked eye. Millions of people were able to hear the beeping radio signal. The Russians quickly followed up with a second Sputnik, which carried the first living thing to break the barrier into space, a small female dog named Laika. Again, the world could listen in on the Soviet adventure. Shortwave radio owners could often hear the dog's heartbeat as she circled the globe. The dog's life in space was a short one. She appeared to have few problems with the launch or even the weightlessness of space, but died in about a week when her air supply ran out. In the first truly cosmic funeral in modern history, poor little Laika's body was cremated as Sputnik 2 burned to a cinder, re-entering the Earth's atmosphere. The American space program wasn't overly concerned about the initial Sputnik shot. It was, after all, a small ball of metal that orbited briefly. The second Sputnik was a different story. Sputnik 2 weighed more than half of a ton, included 2 separate chambers, and it contained a legitimate life support system for Laika. The Americans realized that the Russians must have rocket technology well beyond what the U.S. was capable of producing. The shot prompted much hysteria in the U.S. as politicians and space experts warned that space vehicles could be used for military purposes. The U.S. pinned its hopes on its Vanguard rocket and scheduled a test shot in December of 1957. The pressure was heavy on that first flight, apparently too heavy. Just 1 second after liftoff, the Vanguard rocket lost power and ended up in a tremendous fireball. The press labeled the effort Kaputnik. America was finally successful with its Explorer 1 in January of 1958, but it was clear the U.S. significantly trailed Russia in the space race. In May of 1961, newly elected President John F. Kennedy decided to put new stress on the space program and announced in a joint session of Congress that the U.S. was about to enter a formal race with the Soviet Union to see which country could be the first to reach the moon.
The dramatic achievements in space which occurred in recent weeks should have made clear to us all, as did the Sputnik in 1957, the impact of this adventure on the minds of men everywhere who are attempting to make a determination of which road they should take. Now it is time to take longer strides, time for a great new American enterprise, time for this nation to take a clearly leading role in space achievement, which in many ways may hold the key to our future on Earth. I therefore ask the Congress, above and beyond the increases I have earlier requested for space activities, to provide the funds which are needed to meet the following national goals. First, I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space.
This race became an incredible milestone in human history. It took man beyond his tiny backwater planet into the huge universe that lies outside Earth's portals. It gave man first entry into worlds previously only dreamed of. Mankind had questioned what lay beyond Earth's atmosphere. Speculation about life in our solar system has long concentrated on the planet Mars. While the galaxy is packed with all types of heavenly bodies, planets, moons, black holes, quarks, quasars, comets, and meteorites, Sometime in our history, the small planet Mars was singled out as the most likely home of intelligent life. Perhaps Mars became the focus of all these questions in the Victorian era, when astronomers first began to get clear views of the Martian surface. It was obvious the planet had polar ice caps and what appeared to be canals that could be bringing water to arid areas. At some time in the more recent past, man for some reason decided that if there were Martians, they must be creatures bent on invading Earth to steal water or food, or to kill or enslave humans. One of the most infamous of Martian attacks occurred in the imaginations of British author H.G. Wells and American actor and director Orson Welles. The British Wells wrote the paperback potboiler, The War of the Worlds, in 1898. The book prompted a number of literary knockoffs, plays, television productions, and a 1953 Paramount film that won an Academy Award for special effects. But it also spawned a 1938 radio play that revealed just how frightening and real the threat of an extraterrestrial invasion was in the human mind. Ladies and gentlemen, we interrupt our program of dance music to bring you a special bulletin from the Intercontinental Radio News. At 20 minutes before 8 Central Time, Professor Farrell of the Mount Jennings Observatory, Chicago, Illinois, reports observing several explosions of incandescent gas occurring at regular intervals on the planet Mars. Thus began Wells' radio play. The imaginary landing was at the small town of Grover's Mills, New Jersey, and the bug-like Martians came to Earth with trouble on their minds.
We now return you to Carl Phillips at Grover's Mill.
Ladies and gentlemen, here I am. Wait a minute, something's happening. There's a jet of flame springing from the mirror, and it leaps right at the advancing men. Lord, they're turning into flames.
The Martians were indescribable, the imaginary newscaster told us. They had eyes that are black and gleam like a serpent. The mouth is V-shaped, with saliva dripping from its rimless lips that seem to quiver and pulsate. More than 1 million people all across the U.S. were panicked by the realistic-sounding report. And before they realized the coincidence that this was all happening the day before Halloween, many listeners fled their homes. Some cried and prayed in the streets. There were even a few claims of related suicides. It was so real to a few people they swore to have seen the fires of the alien attack in the distance. Mankind began looking into the centuries of speculation about extraterrestrial life in 1959, when the Russians won another leg of the space battle, sending their 3 Lunik spacecraft to the moon. Each craft sent back some data about the moon, but none of the information gave any hopes life would be found there. The Soviets built on these successes by being the first to send a man into space. In April of 1961, a 27-year-old pilot named Yuri Gagarin took a short, graceful journey into space. His Vostok 1 spacecraft took a single orbit around the Earth as Gagarin looked through his craft window and described the beauty of the Earth. He stayed aloft only 108 minutes before re-entering the atmosphere and parachuting to Earth. 3 weeks later, the first American broke the bonds of Earth as Alan Shepard and his Freedom 7 spacecraft went on a journey of slightly more than 15 minutes.
Godspeed, gentlemen.
The Americans followed up the same year with their first orbiting flight when an astronaut who later became a U.S. Senator, John Glenn, took a 5-hour flight around the Earth.
I feel fine. Capsule is turning around. Oh, that view is tremendous. Roger. Understand go for at least 7 orbits.
What followed was a difficult period for both space programs. The Americans had a tragic launch pad fire in 1967 during a practice run. 3 astronauts were killed. The Russians lost several of their lunar spacecraft, and one of the primary forces behind their program, rocket engineer Sergei Korolev, died in 1966. This left the Russian space program confused and divided. The Americans quickly overcame the fire tragedy and still managed to move into the breach left by the lack of direction in the Soviet program. On July 16, 1969, 3 astronauts, Michael Collins, Buzz Aldrin, and Neil Armstrong, blasted off on the most important journey ever taken by humans. The 3 men had been selected for this incredible adventure by lot. Their ship was Apollo 11. The morning was clear and beautiful. The world was listening as T-minus 4 minutes was announced. An enormous crowd of onlookers had been arriving for weeks. They grew deathly silent as liftoff approached.
This is Apollo Saturn Launch Control. We are still go at this time. T-minus 15, 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9. We have ignition sequence start. The engines are armed. 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. We have commit. We have liftoff.
plan was for Apollo 11 to go into orbit around the moon, while Aldrin and Armstrong steered a tiny lunar landing module called the Eagle to the moon's surface. Collins would be back at the orbiting command module, the Columbia. After a short moonwalk, the Eagle would rendezvous with Columbia, and all three astronauts would return to Earth. Things appeared to go like clockwork. Aldrin and Armstrong successfully landed their module at the second choice among landing sites, the huge lunar plain called the Sea of Tranquility. But things were dicey for a time. Armstrong and Aldrin had to maneuver the module around some huge boulders, and they touched down with only about 30 seconds of fuel remaining. Armstrong was about to turn 39. He was a shy, young test pilot from a small town in Ohio. But he made history when he announced to Mission Control in Houston,
Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot.
He quickly took his remarkable deed a step further when he squeezed through the Eagle's forward hatch and stepped down the short ladder. Before leaving the craft, he switched on a television camera, and much of the world watched as he placed his foot on lunar soil. He stopped a moment to look at the module's footpads, which he reported back to Houston were only depressed into the moon's surface about 2 inches. Then he gave the world some of the most memorable words ever to escape the lips of man.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
The lunar leap was indeed a giant one. It gave mankind answers to some of the most difficult questions of our time. But it also left us with a clear demonstration of how much is left to learn. edges of our solar system and deep space still hold incredible mystery. Scientists only recently began to recognize the existence of unexpected deep space objects like quasars, pulsars, and black holes. We now know that quasars are star-like objects that must be many times brighter than entire galaxies. Pulsars are rapidly blinking remnants of supernova explosions. And then there are the mysterious galactic whirlpools called black holes. Some physicists believe these phenomena developed when super-dense stars, some with a mass 10 times that of our sun, began to age and exhaust the nuclear fuel in their core. In their prime, these stars were so dense that their gravity pulled in everything around them. As the stars ran out of fuel, they began to collapse under the weight of their own gravity. That gravitational pull actually drew all their mass and light back to the core of the dying star, and a huge gravitational force field resulted. These black holes are now being recognized by the way they suck sometimes enormous heavenly bodies into their center. We are also left with the mystery of why life as we know it sprang up on a fairly minor blue ball planet orbiting a fairly average star in a typical spiral galaxy. Religious men see a divine hand in Earth's selection as the cradle of life. There might have been a time when scientific men would have sneered at this idea. But the recent past has brought the religious and scientific closer together. There was a time when scientists believed the cosmos was infinite in nature. In fact, the Greek philosopher Aristotle was strongly against the idea of a definite beginning for the universe. He didn't like the implication of divine intervention. He preferred to believe the universe always existed and would continue forever. Until the 1920s, science generally agreed with Aristotle. It was then that scientists found strong proof that the universe is actually expanding. Space is growing. And if you work backward from a growing universe, you come to the clear conclusion there must have been a beginning point. Most scientists now believe that there was actually a point in time that most have labeled a Big Bang, when the beginnings of the universe emerged from nearly nothing. They theorize an incredible inflation of matter when a tiny speck grew 1,000,000,000,000,000,000,000,000 times in a fraction of a second. Long before science recognized this, religious men already believed in a dramatic beginning for the universe. The book of Genesis in the Old Testament of the Jewish and Christian religions boldly proclaims that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Who can imagine a bigger bang than that? Men of vision and open minds have always realized that the real beauty of this universe isn't what we know about it, but what we have yet to learn. In the 1600s, Galileo said, "Who should set a limit to the mind of man? Who would dare assert that we know all that is to be known?" The British theoretical physicist Stephen Hawking claims that when he has succeeded in his efforts to combine general relativity and quantum mechanics, he will then know how the universe began. But he admits he still won't know why it began. And so, the mystery continues.